Today's show, Liz investigates the science of GM.
How do you introduce it into the plant genome?
We actually use blank .22 caliber bullets.
Dr. Yan tries to shatter glass.
Oh, brilliant.
And I try and cure Jem's dust allergy. Let me pitch this to you. Meet my friend, the worm. That's Bang Goes a Theory.
What have I got to lose?
Revealing your world with a bang.
Hello, welcome to Bang Goes the Theory. Now, some areas of science will inevitably attract more controversy than others, and GM, or genetic modification, is definitely near the top of that list. So I went to Hawaii to see GM in action. Controversial biotechnology is definitely not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Hawaii, especially since this US state has an incredible and fragile biodiversity. But over the last 10 years, these islands have become one of the world's leading centres in research of GM, or genetically modified foods. Scientists here set the standard back in 1998 when they produced this papaya, the first genetically modified fruit deemed fit for human consumption by the US Food and Drug Administration. So why is GM so prevalent here? Well, in Hawaii, tropical fruit is very big business. For decades, the islands have dominated the supply of papaya to mainland USA and to Japan, bringing in a staggering $17 million a year. But keeping up with that kind of demand means very intensive farming. One of the biggest problems with intensive agriculture is vulnerability to disease. Now, as early as the 1940s, Hawaiian papaya growers were struggling against a virus called ring spot that invaded the islands and decimated their crops. Now, the farmers tried to move the papaya, but the disease hopped from island to island with incredible ease. And by 1997, the entire Hawaiian papaya industry was facing collapse. Step forward, GM, and researcher Dr. Dennis Gonzalez.
Look at this fruit here. You notice that these have ring spots.
Gosh, this thing here.
Dennis grew up on a Hawaiian sugar plantation and knows how important agriculture is to the islanders. So to save the papaya industry, he turned to what was then the very new science of genetic engineering.
The scientists proposed that if you take a gene from the pathogen, let's say in this case the virus, and you insert it into the host, you will make that host resistant to the virus.
So there's something in the DNA or the genetic makeup of the virus that can actually protect another organism from it if you extract that particular sequence.
That was the hypothesis in 1985. We had to isolate that specific gene out of the virus and then clone it.
You extract it, you make multiple copies. How do you introduce it into the plant genome?
We actually shot it in. We used a gene gun, and what we did is we coated tungsten pellets, which would be the bullets. We coated it very, very old microns. We then propelled it using a gene gun. At that time, we used blank .22 caliber bullets to fire it into the cells. Now, out of the millions of cells that the genes went into, some of them pick up the gene, and the gene gets inserted into the nucleic acid.
That's incredible to think about it that way. You're literally shooting viral DNA into your papaya cells, and it gets inside the nucleus and inserts itself into the existing genome. Right. How did it work?
It really saved the industry, no doubt about it.
But saving the industry came at a cost. First, Hawaii lost its valuable Japanese customers. They didn't want to buy GM foods until more research was done into the effects on health and the environment. Then it turned out that the variety they used to create the GM papaya had another problem of its own. This is the papaya, which is genetically modified to be ring spot resistant. This type is more prone to an infection by a root fungus, similar to the one that caused the Irish potato famine. And now this fungus is threatening to decimate the entire papaya industry all over again. So 25 years later, it's back to the lab for a second dose of GM. So David, tell me what you did to deal with this problem that arose with the GM papaya.
Well, what is amazing is grapes and grape plants are naturally resistant to this fungus. It contains a gene for an enzyme with the technical name stilbene synthase.
But rather than using a gun to shoot the new gene into the papaya, they smuggle it in a very clever way using a bacteria.
And so we have a solution of the agrobacteria here containing this grape DNA. We then take the clusters of papaya cells, which are grown here, and we mix them in here with the agrobacteria. And under those conditions, the agrobacteria will infect these papaya cells.
So they've got the grape DNA inside them.
Right.
And now they grow.
They're multiplying.
They multiply and they're multiplying.
Right. And here's an example of a baby papaya genetically engineered plant with all the leaves forming, and you can now start to see roots forming on the bottom.
So at what stage does this little baby plant make its way to the farmer?
Well, actually, the plant has to go through a number of tests to make sure it's substantially equivalent to non-engineered fruit. So once those tests are done, and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration and the USDA get to review all the data of the tests, and then it's released to the farmer as seed.
So, did you eat the papaya?
I ate the papaya, to be polite to Mr. Gonzalez, but I would be lying if I said I didn't think about it for a split second beforehand. It's a very complicated science.
Did it taste nice, the papaya?
Yeah, it was quite sweet.
But that's the thing, I think everybody, or certainly a lot of people are very confused by the whole GM question. But it's, looking at that film, it clearly seems to work in terms of protecting crops against disease. And if you sort of look at it, if you sort of look at the big picture, I guess you could argue that since we've had agriculture, we've been manipulating plants. Isn't this just an extension of that? What's the problem?
No, absolutely. And, it's important to point out that every crop is dealt with as a case-by-case scenario, and it goes through stringent regulations, etc. But I think the main concerns arise because genes are incredibly complicated things. We're only beginning to understand how little we know about our own genomes. All that junk DNA we learned about in school, it's not junk DNA. Our genes interact in really intricate ways that we still don't fully understand, okay? So some scientists say it's absolutely fine, there's no problems. Other scientists raise issues like, can we just find out a little bit more about long-term effects to genes? So, for example, can gene flow happen between the crop and bacteria in the soil? Can genes end up in human beings? What are the long-term effects to human health? Those questions are still being raised with regards to GM crops.
I don't know, I just have to trust somebody else on these things. I spend my professional life trying to get on top of the world of science. Yeah, I watch your film, I know a little bit more about GM crops. I could not hazard a guess of the full implications of putting the DNA, or like some of the DNA virus, into the genome of a papaya.
It's a beautiful technology in one sense, but then the beauty of science is that there is always still more to learn, and certainly this is the case with something complex as GM. Let me give you a few examples of some of the issues that are raised with regards to this technology, okay? As with the case with papaya, okay? GM papaya crops do crossbreed with non-GM papaya crops. That's what happened in Hawaii. And, that's why Japan were so strict about, banning the import of papaya because of the cross-contamination issue. Other issues that come to mind are things like if you're growing a pest-resistant crop, that means you're possibly pushing the resistance of those pests till they become very difficult to kill. And the other things are, scientists are asking questions like, do GM crops affect the ecosystems in which they're grown? What are the long-term effects of, do microbes get affected in the soil, etc.? Yeah. And they just are simply pushing for more, research into that area. But as always with science, the research will continue, and hopefully we'll know more about those kind of questions in the future.
And it could be brilliant. I mean, it's a piece of